think we can start with some housekeeping type things first. Thanks to everybody who's joining us today. I put up a slide thing to sort of indicate please mute your line when you're not speaking if you're able to do so, and that'll keep the noise levels down. Then this is going to be an open discussion kind of situation, not necessarily going to be a presentation. I didn't really prepare a presentation or anything like that. So we really do want people to share their thoughts and share their both concerns that have come up and questions that have come up, but also ways that people are dealing with solutions. The muting when you're not talking thing is mostly just to keep background noise down. We don't want it to discourage people from getting involved in the conversation. So so a quick reminder of sort of like the goal, the idea behind the call today. I've been on a lot of calls over the course of the last couple of weeks that are focused on the delivery of indigent defense services and even civil legal aid services during this weird crisis time. And what we've found is that, at least what I've noticed, and I think Andy and Meg were also noticing this and others on our list, we're noticing that there are things that are specific to research within those contexts and data collection and answering research questions during this time that was just not really coming up in those other calls. And so we wanted to create a space to talk about, as much as possible, create a space for people who do that kind of work to talk to each other. So our first sort of like prompt question to get us started talking about this is very broad. So that's to sort of start the ball rolling. We wanted to open up for people to talk about what the impacts of this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, have been on defense, policy, and practice. And that can be a very wide question. If people have things beyond just like, it's very bad and it's very hard, because I know we're all sort of feeling that. We'd love to hear from people about what is morphed during this time, and maybe even which policy initiatives have necessarily become the highest priority because of what's happening now. So I'll quiet down if anybody wants to jump in on that question.
Is saying you found from the client?
I think that might have been background noise, not the question. I know that, I've been observing on the listservs and things like that, initiatives that are about bail and people who enter jail on first appearance have sort of had to become the policy priorities. And I'd be curious to hear more from people who have had to implement those kinds of policy priority changes, how they've done so, and how research and data factors into those kinds of pushes.
This is Dana Eddy from West Virginia.
Hi.
Research, one of our primary concerns, the prisons in West Virginia, the jails and prisons are substantially overcrowded by about 10%. And the jails, of course, are mostly populated at least half, if not more, by pre-trial detainees. So the first initial effort was to figure out a way to get the situation addressed of those who were within the prisons, because with substantial overcrowding, social distancing is a difficult thing to begin with anyway, but when it's overcrowded, it's even more so. And it's funny, there was no mechanism really to do it, except we wrote a letter to the Supreme Court of Appeals of our state and asked that they enter an order requiring sort of mediation. New Jersey had done something similar that resulted in mediation. The Supreme Court took it and then themselves met with Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So we ended up at the end of that having over 80 people released and populations of jail substantially diminished. We've now filed habeas on behalf of a bunch of people we think who are situated in such a manner that releasing them would not be further endangering to the public. Although if you read our newspapers, you will see that many people believe that what we're doing is letting murderers and rapists out back. We want the prison doors opened so they can escape. What we have done as a research opportunity is asked our public defender corporations to keep track of those individuals who were released on their own recognizance rather than bail, or those who were released on bail, or those who were released early for parole purposes, so that we could track them and sort of dispel the myths that bails people, for example, in our state spread, that if you release people in their own recognizance, they don't show up. So for the first time, we have an opportunity to basically track people who have been released for specific purposes in situations where they would normally be detained. And we're hoping that we can use that data to demonstrate going forward that if you release someone on their own recognizance, it's 98% certain they're going to make their first appearance. Or if you release someone early from parole, their recidivism or their violation rate is no higher than it is normally. Otherwise, I mean, that's at least an opportunity we have to try to address some long-term issues as a result of this short-term crisis.
I think that's great. I think that's a great example of new data collection opportunities, or even if people were collecting some of that data, new data collection priorities as a result of everything that's going on. It's also interesting to hear, and correct me if I misunderstood, that the first approach was more of a negotiation policy kind of approach before resorting to the habeas approach, the litigation approach, and then moving on to sort of
it was
the research
somewhat fluid
approach.
because New Jersey, I think everybody's probably familiar with the fact that I think it was their ACLU, had filed some formal motion with their court, and the court took it as an opportunity to order mediation. We sort of mimicked that, except we started out somewhat informally. And I had expected or anticipated the court would actually enter formal order and we might be in the same boat, but they actually took it upon themselves to meet independently of our agency and our attorneys, meet with Division of Correction and Rehabilitations and the Board of Parole and do that. Now, we've had to resort to actual habeas because a lot of that depended upon the cooperation of prosecutors, and in 55 counties, maybe half of them were more than willing to sit down and figure out how to release individuals because nobody wanted to be responsible for an outbreak within the facilities within their jurisdiction. But we are now at the point where we're going to have to do it formally by habeas. But yes, after this is all done, I intend to write some letter or something to the court, to the Chief Justice, indicating that I was especially appreciative of their attentiveness to the issue and their willingness to step out of their formal role and achieve a result that, again, that we over 80 people in a state of our size who were released, that's fairly significant.
Yeah. Anybody else having experiences with initiatives to get people out? I'm especially interested in the part you mentioned about then tracking data as a result and formulating new research questions as a result of those releases to see if there's new questions you can answer. Anybody else having experiences like that? I think that I personally can get uncomfortable with the usage of a phrase like natural experiment when it's in such a emotionally fraught crisis kind of situation. But I certainly think it's fair to say what are our opportunities for asking new research questions, and what old research questions even take on new urgency during this time.
This is Torn Liddell from Indiana. In Indiana, there is not really it's essentially a county by county effort in terms of getting like people out of jails. But some counties are honestly doing a great job, I think, and like some of them have decreased their jail populations by like half or something, which is impressive. And I certainly am going to be trying to get whatever data I can. The data on jail prisoners is already fraught, and I think during this time it will be even more so. But I do have a concern about, because I had those same thoughts that this is like, this has the potential to provide some decent justification for pretrial release, which is something that we're already going super hard on here. But it is such a weird time that like, I don't know if any data we could collect, like, there's no normal to compare against.
Right.
Like we've, you know, maybe I wouldn't be at all surprised if the reoffense rate is way down right now for everybody,
Mm.
pretrial release or no, just because of the situation that we're in. So I'm sure there is something to be done with that, but that seems like a very difficult problem to me.
I think that's a really interesting question. If others have other thoughts on what other research questions pop into our brain, but just that question of how abnormal is this world? You know, how do reoffense rates for just general population compare now? And even arrest rates, crime rates, and all the different, you know, there can be a lot of different reasons those things fluctuate. But at the very least, can we observe things about the world that's different right now? I think that's a really complicated and interesting question.
Yeah, this is Meg. I mean, that's sort of my Meg Ledyard from Travis County, Texas. I work for the court, so we are always watching jail populations. Our defense organization. I mean, so for us, it was an interesting time because our judges signed I think they called theirs a standing order, because we always get compared to Harris County, and Harris County had the general order, so our judges have worked to sort of set something up. There are debates about how good it is, and we're going to have problems measuring that because it went into effect on March 6th. And so people asked, you know, what was the effect of that? And I'm like, well, we only really had a week of implementing it before COVID, which
Right.
led to a lot more releases. And so I think, you know, we're all going to run into those sorts of issues. I think, I mean, you know, as a data person, I'm always interested in the data, whether or not I can say things were causal, because almost never can I. But so I think it is important to realize this is a weird time. I mean, our bookings are half of what they normally are. So whether it's because people aren't doing what they used to be doing, which is probably not it, or the police just aren't arresting people. I mean, some of it's people aren't driving as much, so you're not getting traffic
Right.
stops that lead to other things. So it's just this interesting time to sort of think about what the data really does tell us. But I agree that it's going to be difficult to really, it's not a great natural experiment because the thing that changed affected so many other things and not just release. But I think it's going to be an interesting, I mean, for us, data right now is so important because it's just trying to make sure, like, you haven't missed anyone that, you know, everyone agrees we can release. And then, okay, so now all the people that everyone agrees they're okay with releasing in the crisis, now who's next, you know? And it's just sort of working those lists in a lot of ways and using as much data as we can because people aren't together. And so, you know, something that we may have just talked about before, it's now, if it's in a report, it's so much easier to really work on. So I think those are kind of interesting things too that are happening.
Yeah.
This is Dana from West Virginia again. And I agree, for example, you know, maybe some people are violating their parole, but they're just not being picked up and arrested as opposed to normally. But I think also using that data in some way could show that you don't necessarily have to arrest every individual in every circumstance and bring them in and detain them if your intent is to protect the public. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to look at it, but I think we can also twist some of the information and some of the data to show that maybe we were arresting people at too high a rate, an accelerated rate before this for no other purpose than simply putting them in jail for 2 or 3 days and risking their jobs and their families and whatever, and by letting them stay out, it didn't significantly endanger the public.
I think that's a really a great point that this is, as a lot of people have observed, this crisis just lays bare, the analogy I've been using on a lot of other calls is lifting up the rock, right? And seeing this is just what the world has always looked like. We just weren't really looking at it. And I think this presents an opportunity to do that. But I think Meg's point about, treating this in any way as a natural experiment is very challenging because like everything, there's just too many linked variables that are all changing at the same time. Um, Robert shared in the chat, and I'm just going to read it out so that everybody can get it as part of the conversation. Thank you, Robert. Even though the data is not necessarily causal, the recognition that quote unquote everyone agrees certain people are safe to be released, they should not have been incarcerated in the first place. As Dana is saying, we have to find a way to get police, prosecutors, and courts to keep going. And I think that's exactly right. That's I think what a lot of what you were saying, Dana, is this is a moment to really demonstrate all the stuff we were doing before was way more than needed to be done in order to quote unquote protect public safety. I am wary, of course, of the question of how do you measure public safety when we know there's been such a shift to, what it means to be safe in public, when there's such a huge shift to what it means to be in public. But I think it's exactly right to really see from a policy perspective how much further down the road, keep going, how much further down the road we can get prosecutors, courts, etc., to keep moving. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Hi, this is Tom O'Connor from the Georgia Public Defender Council. We've had a lot of good success with our executive director working with our Council of Superior Court Judges to develop outlines that they send out to all the 149 superior courts in the state, just about measures to limit transmission among detained clients. For example, things like not issuing arrest warrants for technical violations of probation, obtaining bond or time served for misdemeanor cases. And so we found that to be useful, although it really depends on the judge, and we have so many counties and so many courts.
Yeah, very interesting. I know that's in New York. I think a lot of it has depended on where, and I'm connected with people across the state, and the difference is huge and drastic between the city and the rest of the state, but also still pretty different between different counties upstate. Local jurisdiction is handling stuff. Anybody else have thoughts? We're sort of loosely talking. I think it's to be thinking about how would data be useful, and even what opportunities do we see to collect new data during this time is something that I think we'd all be very interested in. I'm also interested in the question of how do you monitor data quality in a sort of remote working environment? If anybody has thoughts on that, how do you keep tabs on the quality of data entry and how data workers are doing their work when people are all working remotely? If anybody has thoughts on that. And all I can really say on that is that all the things that worked before are the things that really just are now more important. And if people are finding that that's the case, I'd love to hear people talking about that too. But the importance of monitoring data quality and, when people are sort of doing arraignments from their own homes over video with a court, the idea of data collection being, they have to prioritize getting it all into a case management system seems like a very seems like a fraught thing to try to push during this time, but also just incredibly important when your normal systems for data quality checking aren't around.
This is Andy Davis from the Decent Center. I think I just wanted to, I think I would reaffirm that experience, echo it back to you, Stephen. We've been thinking about how to continue with our research on site at the Decent Center, and we've had to eliminate any work that involved things like site visits or kind of in-person interaction between us and any research subject. And what we've instead done, of course, is doubled down on a lot of the work that does involve either data entry or the use of existing, often administrative data sets, not always administrative anyway, large statistical data sets. And so in that sort of slight shift of focus, obviously accuracy and consistency in data entry and so on are understanding and are necessary in almost all research contexts. But it's been interesting to focus specifically on the kind of statistical part. It puts us in this situation of as researchers needing to be in touch very, very often as we're doing our work about our understanding of the data, in touch very, very often about if we're actually doing new analyses or recodes of data or something like that to make sure that we're properly coordinated. It is one of these jobs where I think what it's made me realize is that first of all, we are white collar workers, which means we're among the fortunate percentage of American workers as researchers who can do a lot of things from home. It's a lot of it is a desk job. But then there is this other part of the work, certainly the part of the work that I always kind of relished, which was the interpersonal connections and the generation of new data through interviews and things like that, that has had to totally stop. So it's been a bit of a change in work styles, but I think that I've been reflecting on what you just said, Stephen, about data quality checking. And it has been possible to put a lot of that online just by establishing like a lot of routine check-in with each other by Zoom calls and stuff like that.
I think that that's really interesting, and to think about sort of the in-person research projects that have had to maybe take a pause, and how to maybe think about how quote unquote reopening we're hearing that a lot in the news and what that would mean for those kinds of projects. Heather Harris put in the chat, I'll just read it out so that everybody can contribute. I have Heather Harris says, I have questions about how courts are operating right now, but I think it is a bit of a side topic. And I think I'm really interested in that. So Heather, if you want to jump in and share those thoughts, I'd love to hear it. I also am curious how are courts operating and what we can do as people who are observers of that process.
So this is Heather Harris, and I work at the Public Policy Institute of California. I've been working with one of my research associates just to try to get a handle on what the different superior courts in California are trying to do, like what kind of cases they're actually hearing, how they're handling it. And it's been, really challenging. So, first of all, I'm like, her name's Alex. I'm like, Alex, go out there and try and figure out, like, look at the websites, look at the Judicial Council's website, see what they're trying to do.
Right.
And then, so it becomes like a back and forth, like, I don't really know how to interpret this. And so it seems to me like there's a ton of variation. So, jury trials in general are not happening unless, there is a timing issue, like there couldn't be a time waiver. But then trying to figure out what's going on, like who's being arraigned. It looks like if you're in custody, you're probably being arraigned, but that's taking about, 2 to 3 times as long. And, more videos than normal. But then what's happening for misdemeanors is kind of completely obtuse. Who is, I just, one of the things that I'm struggling with is like, how do people even know whether they're, should they show up for their court hearings? How is that even being communicated? And I'm wondering if any of the public defenders can speak to this, because it seems like there's, a little bit of chaos. Maybe the court calendars aren't always up to date. And I think, in terms of like all the stuff we're talking about, like about data collection, data quality, I mean, it's hard to do any of that when these basic processes, like you don't understand any of that. And so I'm just curious what people know and if it seems sort of similar in other states.
Yeah, anybody please chime in on that. I know what I'm observing in New York is that is absolutely chaos. people generally just have to like call the court and ask, am I set for this? Are we still doing this thing? I think it's a reality that a lot of, I know I recently stopped working at the Bronx Defenders, but while I was working there, and I'm still in touch with a lot of people there, and a thing that I'm sort of learning from my friends who still work there, and they're all kind of learning together, is that arraignments really is like a big part of the job, and just the logistics of staffing the arraignments was like the number one thing that needed solved most immediately, and then the rest of this is still actually kind of chaotic. But I'd love to hear from people who are still embedded at those kinds of places, what observations they have. I think it's a theme that as you get more to, from state to city to municipal to like mayor's courts, that, that the level of smallness of the court is, very much related to how much chaos you'll experience trying to figure out what the hell they're doing.
Yeah, it's very strange. Like, some of the courts are really good at, communicating what people need to know, just even on the website. But in California, a lot of the courts, like the clerk isn't even open. So you couldn't call to get an answer about what you're supposed to be doing, and some courts have, like you can sign up for text message reminders, or you're being told to like call your attorney, but what if you don't have an attorney? It's just,
and who are they going to call?
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So people who are carrying caseloads during this whole crisis, or who are supervising people who carry caseloads during this crisis, what experience are you having? I'm sure there are some people on this call who are in that boat.
I don't, this is Meg again. I don't carry cases, obviously, for those of you that know me. I work in the court system. So in Texas, I know what our court is doing very well, which is just one county. And I know a little bit about what the Office of Court Administration has told everyone. So Texas is interesting. They bought Zoom licenses for all the courts. So every court has its own Zoom license through the state. And then so the ability to do, for us, we're doing remote hearings. We're only dealing right now with people who are in jail. Everyone who's out of jail has been pushed off. And right now it's still May 8th, but I don't think anyone believes that's going to be the end of it. And the governor is going to talk today. So we're doing remote hearings. Because of open records, they have to stream them through YouTube. So you can actually, in some cases, it's easier to watch what's going on. But again, it's only in jail cases. And we're working to sort of figure out, well, what are we going to do about out of jail cases? Because this is going to go on for a while. And so it's, questions about how do defense attorneys talk to their clients, and what if their client doesn't have the right technology, and all of that kind of stuff. It's very interesting, but I'm happy to talk offline about exactly what we're doing. But I don't know anything about California.
And like I said, I'm on calls with a lot of New York folks, who work primarily in the civil legal aid context, and they are also sort of scratching their heads. We're trying to plan a series of webinars on how to work in this new environment, and we keep pushing off the one for the courts because the court keeps saying to us, we don't know what to tell people yet. We just can't get them to come on and do a 1-hour webinar on like, this is our plan, this is how we're approaching this, because I think they really are week to week trying to figure out what they're doing.